They called her broken, damaged goods. A woman whose womb had failed her, whose worth had shattered with one fall from a horse. Lydia Cross was 23 years old when her family shipped her west like unwanted cargo, a barren bride sent to fill a widower's kitchen and nothing more. They expected her to disappear into shame and silence, but in the dust and loneliness of a New Mexico ranch, she would become something they never imagined, the only woman a haunted cowboy would ever love. This is her story. Watch until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lydia's journey travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Lydia Cross felt her stomach drop with it. Through the dust-caked window, she could see nothing but emptiness. Endless brown earth stretching toward distant purple mountains, sparse patches of brittle grass clinging to life beneath a merciless sun. This was New Mexico territory, 1885, and it looked exactly like what it was, the end of the earth, the place where unwanted things were sent to die. "Rowan Ranch, miss," the driver called down, his voice neither kind nor unkind, just matter of fact. He'd delivered plenty of mail-order brides before, and he'd deliver plenty more. What happened to them after wasn't his concern. Lydia gathered her carpet bag and the small wooden trunk that contained everything she owned: 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a photograph of herself at 17 when the world still held promise, and a silver hairbrush that had been her grandmother's. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her traveling dress, gray wool that had seen better days, just like her. She was 23 years old, and her life was already over. No, that wasn't quite right. Her life had ended 18 months ago, on a bright October morning when her horse had spooked at a rattlesnake. She'd been thrown, a bad fall, the kind that knocked the wind from your lungs and the hope from your future. She'd been 3 months pregnant then, engaged to Robert Patterson, the banker's son. Everyone in Coopersville, Pennsylvania had called them the perfect match. The fall had taken the baby. The subsequent infection had nearly taken her life, and Dr. Brennan's grim prognosis had taken everything else. The damage is extensive, Miss Cross. I'm sorry to say that bearing children may prove unlikely, perhaps impossible. Robert had ended their engagement within a week. "I need sons to carry on the family name," he'd explained, unable to meet her eyes. "You understand, don't you, Lydia? It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. As if her entire worth as a woman hadn't just been reduced to the failure of her body. As if she were a broken piece of machinery that couldn't perform its function. Her father had been more direct. "You've brought shame on this family," he'd said, his face hard as granite. "Walking around town, everyone knowing you're damaged, everyone pitying us." Her mother had cried. Oh, how she'd cried. But the tears hadn't stopped her from finding the advertisement in the matrimonial news. "Widower rancher, New Mexico territory, seeks practical woman for household duties. Companionship only, no expectations of children." "It's a second chance, Lydia," her mother had whispered, pressing the newspaper clipping into her hands. "A way to start fresh where nobody knows. Where you won't be a constant reminder of what happened." A reminder, that's what she'd become. A walking memorial to failure and shame. The stagecoach driver opened the door, and the heat hit her like a physical force. Pennsylvania had been cool when she'd left 3 weeks ago, autumn painting the trees in gold and crimson. Here, the October sun blazed white and merciless, and the air smelled of dust and something sharp, sage maybe, or creosote. "Need help with your trunk, miss?" "No, thank you. I can manage." She'd been managing on her own for 18 months now. What was one more trunk? Her boots hit the hard-packed earth, and she looked up at the house that would be her home. It was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with a deep porch that wrapped around 2 sides, built from rough-hewn timber and adobe. The roof was tin, glinting silver in the harsh sunlight. Behind it, she could see a barn, a corral with a few horses, and several smaller outbuildings. It wasn't prosperous exactly, but it wasn't poverty either. Caleb Rowan was a working rancher, the marriage broker had told her. A man who'd lost his wife and young son 5 years ago. A man who needed someone to cook and clean, nothing more. A man who wouldn't ask questions about her past or make demands her body couldn't fulfill. A man who was currently standing on the porch, watching her with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor. His face was weathered and angular, carved from sun and wind and something darker. Grief, maybe, or resignation. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, worn longer than fashion dictated, and his jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of beard. He wore a simple cotton shirt, dark trousers held up with suspenders, and boots that had seen years of honest wear. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been alone too long, a man who'd forgotten how to be anything else. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the dusty yard. The barren bride and the haunted widower, two broken people brought together by circumstance and desperation. Then Caleb Rowan nodded once, a slight dip of his chin that might have been greeting or acknowledgement or simply recognition that she'd arrived. He turned and walked into the house without a word. The stage driver cleared his throat. "He ain't much for talking, Mr. Rowan, but he's honest, pays his bills on time, treats his horses fair. Could do worse." "Thank you," Lydia managed, though her throat felt tight. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back up to his seat. Within minutes, the stagecoach was disappearing back down the rough track that passed for a road, leaving her alone in a cloud of settling dust. Alone. The word had never felt so absolute. Lydia picked up her trunk. It wasn't heavy, evidence of how little she'd been allowed to bring, and walked toward the house. Each step felt like a surrender, like she was walking away from the life she'd imagined toward one she'd never wanted. But what choice did she have? Return to Pennsylvania, where every face held pity or scorn? Become a burden to her parents, a permanent reminder of their daughter's failure? No. This was her future now. She would make the best of it. The porch steps creaked under her weight. She paused at the door, uncertain whether to knock or simply enter. This was her home now, wasn't it? But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stranger's house where she was an uninvited guest. Before she could decide, the door swung open. Caleb Rowan stood in the doorway, blocking most of the light from inside. Up close, she could see more details. The fine lines around his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his mouth was set in a permanent line that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile. "Your room's upstairs," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Second door on the right. Supper's at 6. I take breakfast at 5 before I head out to the range. You'll find everything you need in the kitchen." "Thank you, Mr. Rowan. But he'd already turned away, disappearing deeper into the house. Lydia stood in the doorway, her trunk at her feet, and felt the last fragile hope in her chest crack just a little more. She didn't know what she'd expected. Certainly not warmth, not after the marriage broker had made it clear this was a practical arrangement only, but perhaps a few more words, a question about her journey, some acknowledgement that she was a human being rather than a piece of furniture that had been delivered. She picked up her trunk and stepped inside. The house was dim and cool after the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made: a sofa, 2 chairs, a dining table with 6 seats. Everything was clean but stark, devoid of the small touches that made a house a home. No curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the wooden floors. It looked like a place where someone existed rather than lived. Through an open doorway, she could see the kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a deep sink with a hand pump, shelves lined with basic supplies. Another doorway led to what she assumed was Caleb's bedroom on the ground floor. Lydia climbed the stairs, each step releasing a small creak. The second floor had 3 rooms and a small water closet, luxury she hadn't expected. Her room was the second door, just as he'd said. She pushed it open and felt her breath catch. It was simple: a bed with an iron frame, a dresser, a small table with a basin and pitcher, a chair by the window. But someone had made an effort. The bed was made with clean white linens. A bouquet of dried wildflowers sat on the dresser, chamisa and Indian paintbrush. Their colors faded but still beautiful, and on the bedside table was a lantern, already filled with oil and ready to light. Small gestures, but they broke something inside her. Because they suggested that despite his silence, despite his cold reception, Caleb Rowan had thought about her arrival, had prepared for her, had tried, in his limited way, to make her feel… what? Welcome? That wasn't quite the right word, but perhaps not entirely unwanted. Lydia set down her trunk and walked to the window. It looked out over the ranch, the corral where horses dozed in the afternoon heat, the barn with its weathered red paint, and beyond that, the endless stretch of desert that seemed to swallow everything. In the distance, she could see a thin line of green that suggested a creek or river, and beyond that, mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the horizon. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, like the man who owned it. She turned back to the room and began to unpack. 3 dresses hung in the small wardrobe. Her few underthings went in the top drawer, her mother's Bible on the bedside table next to the lantern. The photograph of her younger self she placed face down in the bottom drawer. She didn't need to be reminded of who she used to be. When everything was put away, she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. The journey that had brought her here. The life she'd left behind. The future that stretched ahead, empty and unknown. She would not cry. She'd shed enough tears over the past 18 months to water the entire desert outside. Crying changed nothing. It didn't bring back her baby or her fertility or her former fiancé or the respect of her community. It didn't make her father look at her with love instead of disappointment. It didn't stop her mother's worried whispers or the pitying glances of neighbors. Crying was useless. Survival wasn't. Lydia stood up, smoothed her dress, and went downstairs to find the kitchen. Wow. The kitchen was better equipped than she'd expected. Cast iron pots and pans hung from hooks near the stove. The pantry held flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, sugar, and coffee. A root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor contained potatoes, onions, and carrots. There was even a small icebox, though it was empty. Ice would be a rare luxury in this climate. She found a side of bacon hanging in the pantry, along with a basket of eggs that were surprisingly fresh. Someone had been maintaining the household supplies, though poorly. Everything was functional but joyless, the bare minimum required for survival. Lydia rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By 6 o'clock, she'd managed to produce a simple meal, bacon fried crisp, eggs scrambled with wild onions she'd found growing near the back porch, cornbread made from the slightly stale cornmeal she'd found in the pantry, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. She set the table for 2 and waited. At precisely 6 o'clock, Caleb appeared from outside, his shirt damp with sweat, dust coating his boots and trousers. He paused when he saw the table, his expression unreadable. Then he walked to the sink, pumped water into a basin, and washed his hands and face with methodical precision. He sat down without a word. Lydia served him first, then herself, and took her seat at the opposite end of the table. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the clink of forks against plates and the distant call of a bird outside. She'd grown up in a household where dinner was a social occasion. Her father would discuss his work at the mill, her mother would share neighborhood gossip, and Lydia would talk about her day. Even after the accident, even when dinners became strained and uncomfortable, there had still been conversation. This silence was different. It was absolute. It pressed against her ears and made her acutely aware of every small sound, her own breathing, the scrape of a chair leg, the settling of the house around them. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. The ranch it's larger than I expected. Caleb glanced up at her, his dark eyes impossible to read. 500 acres, run about 200 head of cattle, 20 horses. Do you manage it yourself? I have 3 hands. They live in the bunkhouse past the barn. They eat there, not here. I see. Silence fell again. He returned to his meal, eating with the same methodical precision he'd applied to washing up. Nothing was savored. It was simply fuel. How long have you been here? She tried again. In New Mexico, I mean. 12 years. Came after the war. The Civil War? He nodded once. Which side did you... She stopped, realizing how intrusive the question was. I'm sorry, that's not my business. Union, cavalry. He finished the last of his eggs and stood, carrying his plate to the sink. Food was good. Thank you. You're welcome. But he was already walking out the back door, letting it swing shut behind him. Lydia sat alone at the table, her own food growing cold, and wondered how long a person could live in silence before they forgot how to speak at all. She fell into a routine quickly because routine was all she had. 5 o'clock. Wake to the sound of Caleb's boots on the stairs. Dress quickly in the dark. Downstairs to start coffee and breakfast, biscuits and gravy, eggs, sometimes bacon or sausage if the smokehouse had any. He would appear at 5:30, eat in silence, and disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. She wouldn't see him again until 6 that evening. The days were hers to fill. She cleaned first, though the house barely needed it. Caleb kept things tidy in his sparse way. But Lydia went deeper, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, washing windows until they disappeared, beating dust from curtains that didn't exist. She found curtain material in a trunk in the third bedroom upstairs and spent 3 days sewing panels for every window. They were simple, unbleached muslin, but they softened the harsh edges of the rooms. She discovered a garden plot behind the house, long abandoned and choked with weeds. She spent a week clearing it, her hands blistering and her back aching, preparing it for a spring planting. She found seeds in the barn, squash, beans, tomatoes, stored in carefully labeled jars. Someone had been a gardener once, Caleb's wife, probably. The thought gave her pause. What had she been like, the first Mrs. Rowan? Had she been happy here, or had she felt the same crushing loneliness that Lydia felt now? How had she died? The marriage broker had been vague. Tragic circumstances was all he'd said. And the child? A son, she'd been told. How old had he been? Lydia wanted to ask, but couldn't find the words. Or rather, couldn't find a moment when Caleb seemed even remotely open to conversation. Their dinners continued in near total silence. Sometimes he would offer a brief comment, storm coming tomorrow, or fence needs mending in the north pasture. But these were statements, not invitations to dialogue. He never asked about her day, never inquired if she needed anything, never acknowledged her presence beyond the most basic practical necessities. It was like living with a ghost. 3 weeks after her arrival, Lydia was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard a crash from outside, followed by a sharp curse. She rushed to the window and saw Caleb near the barn, standing over what appeared to be a broken wheelbarrow. He was shaking his hand, and even from this distance, she could see blood. She didn't think. She simply ran. By the time she reached him, he'd wrapped his hand in a handkerchief, but blood was already soaking through. "Let me see," she said, reaching for him. He pulled back. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're bleeding. Let me help." I heard what you said." Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, months of frustration and loneliness bubbling up. "I'm not useless, Mr. Rowan. I may be barren, but my hands still work. Let me see your damn hand." The profanity surprised them both. Lydia never cursed. Ladies didn't curse. But she'd stopped being a lady the day her baby died, hadn't she? For a long moment, Caleb just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. The cut was deep, running across his palm where the broken wheelbarrow handle had splintered and torn the skin. It would need stitches, or at least very careful bandaging. "Come inside," she said. "I need to clean this properly." He followed her into the kitchen, and she pointed to a chair. "Sit." To her surprise, he obeyed. Lydia pumped water into a basin and gathered clean cloths from the linen drawer. She'd helped her mother tend to injuries before. Her father's mill had been a dangerous place, and someone was always cutting themselves or breaking bones. Her hands remembered what to do even if her heart was pounding. She cleaned the wound carefully, watching Caleb's face for signs of pain. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched her work with those dark, unreadable eyes. "This needs stitches," she said finally. "I can do it if you have needle and thread, but whiskey would help, for the pain and to clean the needle." "Top shelf, left side of the pantry." She found the bottle, good Kentucky bourbon, half empty, and brought it back. "Drink some," she instructed. "This is going to hurt." "I've had worse." "I don't doubt it. Drink anyway." He took a long swallow, and she used the rest to sterilize the needles she'd threaded with the finest cotton thread she could find. Then she began to stitch, her hands steady despite her nervousness. Caleb watched her work, his jaw clenched, but his body still. After a few stitches, he spoke. "You're good at this." "I've had practice. My father worked at a lumber mill. Accidents happened." "Where?" "Pennsylvania, Coopersville, small town." "You wouldn't know it." "What brought you here?" The question hung in the air between them. Lydia kept her eyes on her work, pulling another stitch through his tough skin. "The same thing that brought you to write for a mail-order bride, I imagine." Circumstances. That why they called you barren? Your circumstances. Her hand stilled. He knew. Of course he knew. The marriage broker would have told him. Full disclosure, they called it. No false pretenses. Still, hearing the word from his lips felt like a slap. Yes, she said quietly, resuming her stitching. I had an accident, lost a baby. The doctor said I might not be able to have more, might not be able to have any. My fiancé left. My family decided I'd be better off somewhere far away, where nobody knew the shame of it. So they sent you here. So they sent me here. She finished the last stitch and tied it off, then wrapped his hand in clean bandages. Keep it dry for a few days, change the bandages twice daily. If you see red streaks or feel fever, tell me immediately. Infection can kill. I know. He flexed his hand carefully, testing the stitches. You did good work. Thank you. He stood, but instead of leaving as she expected, he remained by the table, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You said you were barren. Might be barren. The doctor said the damage was extensive, that it was unlikely I could carry a child to term. But not impossible. Unlikely and impossible feel like the same thing when you're a woman whose only value is supposed to be making babies. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd kept it locked away for so long, maintaining a facade of acceptance. But something about this man, this silent, haunted stranger, made the words tumble out. Your fiancé was a fool, Caleb said quietly. Lydia looked up sharply, certain she'd misheard. But he was watching her with something that might have been respect or understanding or simply recognition, one broken person acknowledging another. My wife wasn't barren, he continued, his voice rough. She gave me a son. Beautiful boy, looked just like her. And she was everything people said a woman should be, gentle, obedient, devoted to her family. Didn't stop the Comanche raiders from killing them both when I was out on the range 5 years ago. Lydia felt her breath catch. I'm so sorry. Point is, being able to bear children didn't keep her safe, didn't make her life worth more. She was my wife, and I loved her, and she's gone. And you're here now, and you're not her, and that's fine. I didn't ask for another her. I asked for someone practical who could run a household. He gestured toward the window with his bandaged hand. You've done more in 3 weeks than I managed in 5 years. Fixed the place up. Made it look like somewhere people live instead of just somewhere they survive. Lydia didn't know what to say. It was the most he'd spoken since she'd arrived. Thank you. He nodded and walked toward the door, then paused. Your name's Lydia. Yes. I've been calling you Mrs. Rowan in my head. Felt wrong. You're Lydia. And you're Caleb. Caleb. He tested the sound of his name in his own mouth, like he hadn't heard it in years. Yeah, I guess I am. After he left, Lydia sank into the chair he'd vacated and pressed her hands to her face. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning. It wasn't much, this brief conversation, this small acknowledgement of her humanity, but it felt like water after a long drought. Maybe she could survive here after all. But the next morning, Lydia found a note on the kitchen table, written in rough but legible script. Water pump by the garden is broken. Pump handle needs replacing. Parts in barn on the workbench. She spent the morning trying to figure out how to fix a water pump. She'd never fixed anything mechanical in her life. That had been her father's domain. But she was stubborn, and she had time, and failure felt worse than trying. By noon, she'd managed to remove the old handle but couldn't figure out how to attach the new one. The mechanism was more complicated than it looked, with washers and bolts and pieces that seemed designed to confound her. The next morning, there was another note. Turn the valve to the left first, then the handle slides on. Bolt goes through the side hole. She followed the instructions and had the pump working by lunch. That evening, she left a piece of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth on the porch railing. A small thank you. The next day, the cornbread was gone, and the splintered porch step that had caught her hem twice was replaced with fresh wood. It became their language, this wordless exchange of small kindnesses. Lydia would find things that needed fixing, struggle with them, and wake to find anonymous instructions left on the kitchen table or tucked under a rock by the back door. In return, she left tokens of gratitude. Baked goods, wildflowers in a jar, a basket of darned socks that had been languishing in a drawer. They still barely spoke during meals, but the silence felt different now. Less empty. More like two people who'd forgotten how to use words but were learning other ways to communicate. One morning in early November, Lydia was hanging laundry when she noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the property, watching her. The woman was Mexican, perhaps 16 or 17, wearing a simple cotton dress and a worried expression. "Puedo ayudarte?" Lydia called out, exhausting most of her Spanish. The girl took a hesitant step forward. "You are Señora Rowan?" "Yes. Can I help you?" "My name is Elena. I live with my family at the Mendoza Ranch, 3 miles east. My mother, she is very sick. Fever, coughing. My father is afraid." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "They said you helped Senora Patterson's daughter when she had fever. They said you saved her." Lydia frowned. "I don't know any Senora Patterson. She lives in town. Her daughter, Maria, she was very sick last month. You gave her tea, sat with her all night. She lived because of you." Lydia remembered the night Elena was talking about. She'd gone into town to buy flour and had encountered a woman with a desperately ill child. The local doctor had been drunk, useless. Lydia had simply done what her mother had taught her. Mint tea for the nausea, cool cloths for the fever, willow bark for the pain. She'd stayed until the child's fever broke at dawn, then walked back to the ranch in the morning light. She hadn't thought about it since. It was just something you did when someone needed help. "I'm not a doctor," Lydia said gently. "I don't have any training. Please, my mother is dying. The doctor won't come to our ranch. He says we can't pay. You're our only hope." Lydia looked at the girl's desperate face and thought about her own mother, thousands of miles away in Pennsylvania. If she were sick, wouldn't Lydia want someone to help her? Even if that someone wasn't a real doctor? Even if all they had to offer was kindness and old folk remedies? "Let me get my things." She packed quickly, herbs from her kitchen, clean bandages, a jar of honey, willow bark tea. She left a note for Caleb on the kitchen table. "Gone to help sick woman at Mendoza Ranch, back before supper." Elena led her east across the desert, following a path that was barely visible. They walked for nearly an hour in the harsh midday sun before the Mendoza Ranch came into view. A small adobe structure surrounded by a few scraggly chickens and 2 goats. Inside, the air was stifling and smelled of sickness. A woman lay on a narrow bed, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored. Her husband sat beside her, holding her hand, his face etched with fear and exhaustion. "I'm Lydia Rowan," she said quietly. "I'm not a doctor, but I'll do what I can." The man, Diego Mendoza, simply nodded, his eyes hollow with worry. Lydia spent the next 6 hours fighting death. She brewed tea from willow bark and mint, holding the cup to the woman's lips when she was too weak to drink on her own. She made poultices for the woman's chest to ease her breathing. She bathed her with cool water to bring down the fever. And when the woman began to cough up blood, suggesting pneumonia, Lydia sat beside her and held her hand and prayed to a God she'd stopped believing in 18 months ago. "Please," she whispered, "please don't take her. This family needs her. Her husband needs her. Her daughter needs her. Please." The sun was setting when the fever finally broke. The woman, Marta was her name, opened her eyes and whispered, "Agua." Diego burst into tears, and Elena hugged Lydia so hard she could barely breathe. "Thank you," the girl kept saying. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "She's not out of danger yet," Lydia cautioned. "The fever could come back. She needs to rest, drink plenty of water, eat broth when she can stomach it. And if she gets worse, send for me. Day or night, it doesn't matter." "We have no money to pay you," Diego said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want money. Just take care of her." She arrived back at the ranch well after dark, exhausted and filthy. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen window, a beacon to guide her home. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I lost track of time. I didn't mean to worry you." He stood slowly, his face tight. "Where were you?" "I left a note. The Mendoza Ranch. Their mother was sick." "That's 3 miles away, in the dark, alone." His voice was low but intense, vibrating with something she couldn't quite identify. Do you have any idea what could have happened to you? Mountain lions, rattlesnakes, men who wouldn't care that you're a married woman. I'm sorry, she said again. But she was dying, Caleb. What was I supposed to do? Let her die because walking 3 miles in the dark might be dangerous? You could have waited for me. I would have taken you. There wasn't time, and I didn't know when you'd be back. He ran his good hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. You can't do that. You can't just disappear for hours without... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I thought something happened to you. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Lydia felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt since before the accident. I didn't mean to worry you, she said softly. I didn't think that I'd care? She nodded, unable to speak. Caleb crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. For a moment she thought he might yell at her, but instead he simply pulled her into a fierce hug. It lasted only a few seconds before he released her and stepped back, looking almost embarrassed by the gesture. Next time, he said gruffly, you wake me up. I don't care what time it is. You don't go out alone in the dark. Understood? Understood. Good. He gestured to the table. I kept supper warm. Eat. You look half dead. As she sat down to the meal he'd prepared, simple but edible, Lydia realized something had changed between them. They'd crossed some invisible threshold from strangers sharing a house to something more. Not quite friends, not yet partners, but 2 people who were starting to care whether the other lived or died. It was more than she'd expected when she'd stepped off that stagecoach 6 weeks ago. It was enough to build on. Word spread quickly and through the scattered ranching community. The new Mrs. Rowan had healing hands. She'd saved Maria Patterson in town, saved Marta Mendoza on the Eastern Range. People started coming to the ranch, knocking on the door with sick children, infected wounds, mysterious ailments that the town doctor was too drunk or too expensive to treat. Lydia helped them all. She couldn't turn away suffering, even though she knew she wasn't a real doctor, even though every patient was a risk. She brewed teas and mixed poultices and sat with fevered children through long nights. Sometimes they got better, sometimes they didn't, but they always felt less alone in their suffering, and that seemed to matter. Caleb watched this transformation with something like wonder. His silent, practical wife was becoming something more, a fixture in the community, a person people turned to in crisis. And though he never said it aloud, Lydia could see the respect growing in his eyes. One evening in late November, as they sat on the porch after supper, he finally spoke what had been building between them for weeks. They call you Saint Lydia in town. She snorted. I'm no saint. They say you don't charge nothing, that you sit with dying kids when their own families have given up hope. That's just being human, Caleb. No. He shook his head slowly. Most people are human. You're something else. I'm nothing special. I'm a barren woman who can't give you children. Stop! His voice was sharp, cutting through her self-deprecation. Stop saying that like it defines you. You're not barren. You're Lydia. You're the woman who fixed up this house, who planted a garden, who walks 3 miles in the dark to save a dying woman, who sits with sick children and doesn't count the cost. He turned to look at her, his eyes fierce. You're the woman who makes me remember what it feels like to care about something besides just surviving another day. Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes. Caleb, I'm not good with words, never have been, but I need you to know... He stopped, struggling. I need you to know that you matter, here, to this place, to me. It wasn't a declaration of love. They weren't there yet, maybe never would be, but it was truth, raw and honest, and it meant more than any pretty poetry. You matter to me too, she whispered. They sat in silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, 2 broken people who were slowly learning how to be whole together. The desert stretched endlessly before them, harsh and unforgiving, but somehow, in this moment, it felt like home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Lydia didn't feel afraid. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter came to New Mexico like a whispered threat, cold and sharp in the mornings, deceptively mild by afternoon. Lydia woke one December morning to find frost coating the windows in delicate patterns, transforming the glass into lace. She traced a finger through the ice, watching it melt under her touch, and thought about how much had changed in the 3 months since she'd arrived. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. She'd added small touches everywhere, dried flowers in old bottles, a quilt her grandmother had made draped over the sofa, the curtains she'd sewn now framing every window. The kitchen smelled of bread and herbs instead of dust and loneliness. And Caleb, though still a man of few words, had begun to speak in other ways. He'd built her a shelf in the kitchen for her growing collection of healing herbs. He'd fixed the broken rocking chair she'd found in the barn and placed it by the fireplace. He'd even brought her a stray cat one evening, a scrappy orange tom with a torn ear saying only, "Thought you might want company during the day." The cat, whom she'd named Rusty, had become her shadow, following her from room to room and curling up on her lap in the evenings while she mended clothes or read from her mother's Bible. She was making coffee when Caleb appeared that morning, earlier than usual. His face was troubled, and he held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "Town's planning a harvest celebration, day after tomorrow. They want folks to bring food, have a gathering in the square." He paused, his jaw tight. "They specifically asked if you'd come. Said they wanted to thank you proper for all you done." Lydia felt her stomach tighten. She'd avoided going into town except when absolutely necessary. The ranch hands did most of the supply runs, and she'd been content to remain invisible, helping people who came to her door but never seeking attention. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because—" She struggled to find words that wouldn't sound pathetic. "Because people talk, Caleb. You know they do, and I know what they say about me." "What do they say?" "That I'm barren, that you married damaged goods, that you got cheated in the arrangement because I can't give you sons." She turned away, focusing on the coffee pot. "I hear things. The ranch hands think I don't understand Spanish, but I picked up enough. They call me la estéril, the sterile one." She heard Caleb move behind her, and then his hand was on her shoulder, turning her gently to face him. His eyes were fierce. "Those boys won't be working here much longer if they don't learn respect. And as for what people say—" He shook his head slowly. "Lydia, half the children in this county are alive because of you. You think their parents care about whether you can have babies? They care that you sat up all night with their dying kids and brought them back. But the others don't matter. Let them talk. Let them say whatever poison they want. You know what you are, and I know what you are, and that's enough." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that her worth could be measured in something besides fertility. But 23 years of being told that a woman's primary purpose was to bear children couldn't be erased in 3 months. "Come to the celebration," Caleb said softly. "Let people see you. Let them say thank you. You've earned that. Will you be there?" "Every minute, right beside you." The promise in his voice made her chest ache. When had this quiet, haunted man become her anchor? When had she stopped feeling alone? "All right," she whispered. "I'll go." His face relaxed into something that might have been a smile if he remembered how. "Good. I'll hitch up the wagon." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Lydia baked pies, apple and pumpkin, using the last of the preserved fruit from the cellar. She made 3 loaves of bread and a pot of beans seasoned with salt pork and molasses. It was too much food for a simple gathering, but she couldn't help herself. Cooking was something she could control, something she could do well, and right now she needed that certainty. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and cold. Lydia dressed carefully in her best dress, deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd lost weight since arriving in New Mexico, and the dress hung a bit loose, but she cinched it with her grandmother's silver belt buckle and hoped she looked respectable. Caleb appeared in the doorway as she was pinning up her hair. He'd shaved, she noticed with surprise, and wore a clean shirt she'd never seen before. He looked younger without the beard, and she could see the handsome man he must have been before grief carved lines into his face. "You look nice," he said, his voice rough with what might have been nervousness. "So do you." They loaded the wagon in comfortable silence, and then they were off, following the rough track that led to town. The journey took nearly an hour, and Lydia spent most of it watching the landscape change from empty desert to scattered homesteads to the small collection of buildings that comprised the town of Redemption. She'd been here only twice before, both times quickly. Once to buy flour, once to help Maria Patterson. Now, seeing it in daylight with time to observe, she realized it was smaller than she'd imagined. A main street with perhaps 20 buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, a few other businesses she couldn't identify. At the far end of the street, a large open square had been set up with tables and benches. People were already gathering, and Lydia felt her anxiety spike. There were easily 50 people here, maybe more, all of them strangers, all of them with opinions about the barren bride who'd married Caleb Rowan. "Hey!" Caleb's hand found hers, his calloused fingers wrapping around her smaller ones. "You're not alone. Remember that." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They pulled up to the square, and immediately people began to approach. A woman Lydia didn't recognize took the pies from her hands with a warm smile. "Mrs. Rowan, we're so glad you came. I'm Sarah Mitchell. You saved my nephew last month when he had the croup. I wanted to thank you proper." Before Lydia could respond, another woman appeared. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm Catherine Wells. You helped my sister deliver her baby when the doctor was too drunk to come. We can never repay you." And then they were surrounded, a sea of faces, all smiling, all grateful. Men shook Caleb's hand and thanked him for sharing his wife. Women hugged Lydia and pressed small gifts into her hands, a jar of preserves, a hand-embroidered handkerchief, a small carved wooden cross. Children peeked at her shyly from behind their mother's skirts. The gratitude was overwhelming, and Lydia felt tears prickling her eyes. These people didn't care that she couldn't have children. They cared that she'd help them when they needed it most. But then, from the edge of the crowd, she heard a different voice. "Well, well, if it isn't the barren bride." The words cut through the pleasant chatter like a knife. The crowd fell silent, and people stepped back, creating a path between Lydia and the speaker. She was a woman in her 40s, handsome in a hard way, dressed in expensive clothing that seemed out of place in this rough town. Her lips were curved in a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Mrs. Garrett," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Didn't expect to see you here. I wouldn't miss the chance to welcome your new wife to our community." The woman's gaze traveled over Lydia with obvious disdain. "Though I must say, Caleb, you could have done better. Even in a mail-order arrangement, surely you could have found someone who could actually fulfill a wife's duties." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Caleb went rigid, his hand tightening on hers almost painfully. "That's enough, Margaret," said an older man, stepping forward. Lydia recognized him as Diego Mendoza, Marta's husband. "Mrs. Rowan is a guest here, and she deserves respect." "Respect?" Margaret Garrett laughed, a brittle sound. "For what? For being unable to give her husband children? For being so useless that her own family shipped her west like unwanted baggage?" The words hit Lydia like physical blows. Each one was true, each one a wound she'd thought had scarred over but was apparently still raw and bleeding. "How dare you?" Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you speak to my wife that way?" "Oh, please. Everyone knows the arrangement. You needed a housekeeper, and she needed somewhere to hide her shame. Don't pretend it's anything more than, 'You're wrong.'" The words came from Lydia herself, and they surprised her as much as everyone else. She stepped forward, away from Caleb's protective presence, and faced Margaret Garrett directly. "You're right that I can't have children," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You're right that my family sent me here because they were ashamed of me. You're right that this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but you're wrong about what I am." "And what are you?" Margaret asked with a sneer. "I'm a woman who sits with dying children when their parents have given up hope. I'm a woman who walks miles in the dark to help people I've never met. I'm a woman who makes medicine from herbs and prayers because the town doctor is usually too drunk to function. I'm a woman who turns a house into a home and a stranger into a husband." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I may never bear children, Mrs. Garrett, but I've given life to half the children in this county. I've brought hope to families that had none, and I've loved people who needed loving when no one else would." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret Garrett's face had gone pale, then red with fury. "How dare you?" "No," Lydia cut her off. "How dare you? How dare you reduce a woman's worth to her womb? How dare you decide that because I can't bear children, I'm worthless? I've done more for this community in 3 months than you've probably done in years. And if you can't see that, if all you can see is my inability to get pregnant, then the poverty is yours, not mine." Margaret Garrett opened her mouth, then closed it. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else. But then she simply turned and walked away, her back rigid with fury. The crowd erupted. People were clapping, cheering, surrounding Lydia with words of support and encouragement. Sarah Mitchell hugged her fiercely. Diego Mendoza clasped her hand and said something in rapid Spanish that she didn't understand but recognized as praise. Even the local priest, Father Dominic, came forward to shake her hand and tell her she'd spoken with courage. Through it all, Lydia felt disconnected, like she was watching the scene from a distance. Her heart was racing, her hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. She'd never confronted anyone like that in her life. She'd always been the quiet one, the good girl who didn't make waves. But something had broken inside her when Margaret Garrett spoke those words. Some final fragile piece of the old Lydia, the one who believed her worth was tied to her fertility, had shattered completely. And in its place was something new, something stronger. She felt Caleb's arm slide around her waist, steady and solid. He didn't say anything, just held her as the crowd slowly dispersed back to their celebrations. When they were finally alone, or as alone as you could be in a crowded square, he turned her to face him. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "I was terrified." That's what made it magnificent. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "You stood up for yourself. For us. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life." The words did what Margaret Garrett's cruelty couldn't. They broke her. Lydia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and she buried her face in Caleb's chest, letting him hold her while she cried. They weren't tears of sadness exactly. They were something more complicated, relief and grief and joy and fear all tangled together. "Who is she?" Lydia finally asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Margaret Garrett?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "She's the woman who tried to marry me after Sarah died." Lydia pulled back, looking up at him in surprise. "What?" "My wife's name was Sarah. She died 5 years ago, along with our son Thomas. They were killed by Comanche raiders while I was out on the range." His face was tight with old pain. "Margaret showed up at my door a month after the funeral. Said I needed a woman to run the house, that she'd be willing to take on the burden. Made it clear she expected to become the next Mrs. Rowan." "But you didn't marry her?" "God, no. She's cold as January snow and twice as bitter. She wanted the ranch, not me. When I turned her down, she spread rumors. Said I was too grief-stricken to think straight, that I'd come around eventually. When I didn't, she got mean about it. Started telling people I was half mad with grief, that I'd let the ranch go to ruin." "That's why you sent for a mail-order bride," Lydia said, understanding dawning, "to make it clear you'd never marry her." "Partly, but also because," he struggled with the words, his jaw working, "because this house was too damn quiet, because I was surviving but not living, because I needed someone who wouldn't expect me to be the man I was before. And instead you got a barren woman who can't give you children." "I got you," he said firmly, "and that's more than I deserved." Before Lydia could respond, a commotion erupted near the food tables. A woman was screaming, and people were running toward one of the buildings at the edge of the square. Lydia's heart sank. She knew that kind of panic. Someone was hurt. She ran toward the sound, Caleb close behind her. The crowd parted to let her through, and she found herself looking down at a boy of perhaps 10, lying on the ground, his face blue, his body convulsing. His mother was kneeling beside him, sobbing hysterically. "What happened?" Lydia demanded, dropping to her knees beside the boy. "He was eating an apple. And then he just started choking," a man said, his voice shaking. "We tried to get it out, but—" The boy's lips were turning darker, his eyes rolling back. He was dying right in front of them. Lydia had seen this before back in Pennsylvania. A mill worker had choked on a piece of meat, and her father had saved him by pounding on his back in a specific way. What was it? She tried to remember, her mind racing against the seconds ticking away. "Turn him on his side," she ordered. When no one moved, she snapped, "Now!" Caleb and another man rolled the boy onto his side. Lydia positioned herself behind him and began hitting him between the shoulder blades with the heel of her hand, hard, sharp blows that made the mother wail in protest. "You're hurting him!" "He's already dying," Lydia said through gritted teeth, hitting him again. "This is his only chance." On the 5th blow, the boy coughed. On the 6th, he convulsed. On the 7th, a piece of apple shot from his mouth, and he gasped in a huge, rasping breath. The crowd erupted in cheers. The mother collapsed over her son, sobbing with relief. And Lydia sat back on her heels, her hands shaking, her dress dirty from the ground, and felt the weight of what had almost happened. She'd been seconds from watching a child die. If she'd been wrong, if her memory had failed her, if she'd hesitated a moment longer. "You saved him." Father Dominic was beside her, his weathered face full of wonder. "God works through your hands, child." "No," Lydia whispered. "I just remembered something my father did once. That's all." But people were gathering around her again, touching her shoulders, thanking her, calling her a miracle worker. The boy's mother kissed her hands, her face streaked with tears, speaking in Spanish too rapid for Lydia to follow, but clearly full of gratitude. Through it all, Caleb stood behind her, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos. When she finally managed to stand, her legs wobbling, he was there to steady her. "Can we go home?" she whispered. "Yeah, let's go home." They made their excuses and loaded back into the wagon. The ride home was silent, but Caleb kept one hand on hers the entire time, his thumb rubbing small circles on her palm. It was the most intimate gesture they'd shared, and it made Lydia's heart ache with something she couldn't quite name. When they finally pulled up to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Caleb helped her down from the wagon and didn't let go of her hand. "You know what you are?" he said quietly. "What?" "You're the bravest person I've ever met, and the kindest, and the strongest." He paused, his dark eyes intense. "And you're not barren, Lydia. You're full of life. You're giving it to everyone around you every single day. That's worth more than a dozen babies." Lydia felt fresh tears threatening, but these were different from the ones she'd cried earlier. These were tears of healing, of something broken being slowly made whole. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me, not just the damaged woman who can't have children." "That was never all you were," Caleb said. He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I see you, Lydia, every day. And I'm glad you're here." That night after supper, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold. Rusty the cat curled up between them, purring loudly. The stars overhead were brilliant, countless points of light in the vast darkness. "Tell me about Sarah," Lydia said quietly. "Your first wife. I want to know about her." Caleb was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She was gentle. That's what I remember most. She never raised her voice, never got angry. She'd sing while she worked, these old hymns her mother taught her. And she loved Thomas with everything she had." His voice cracked slightly. He was only 4 when they died, barely old enough to remember his own name. He used to follow me everywhere, asking a million questions. "Papa, why is the sky blue? Papa, where do horses come from? Papa, when I grow up, will I be big like you?" Lydia felt tears sliding down her face, but she didn't brush them away. She just listened. "I was out on the North Range when the raiders came, checking on some cattle that had wandered. By the time I saw the smoke and rode back, they were gone. The house was burning. Sarah and Thomas were—" He stopped, unable to continue. "I'm so sorry," Lydia whispered. "I buried them under the cottonwood tree behind the house, the one that's still standing, and I promised myself I'd never care about anything that much again, because losing them nearly destroyed me. I couldn't survive that kind of pain twice." "But you're caring again," Lydia said softly. "Aren't you?" He turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the starlight. "Yeah, I am. And it terrifies me." "Me too." They sat in silence, the truth hanging between them. They were both scared, of being hurt, of losing again, of hoping for something more than survival. But they were also here, together, slowly building something neither of them had expected. Do you think you could ever love me? Lydia asked, her voice barely audible. Even though I can't give you children? Even though I'm broken? Caleb reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You're not broken, and I think I'm already halfway there. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't poetry or romance or any of the things she dreamed about as a young girl, but it was real and honest, and it made her heart feel fuller than it had in years. I think I'm halfway there too, she confessed. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and when they finally parted to go to their separate bedrooms, hers upstairs, his downstairs, Caleb paused at the bottom of the stairs. Lydia? Yes? Thank you for coming here, for giving this place life again, for giving me life again. Before she could respond, he disappeared into his room, leaving her standing alone in the darkened house. But she didn't feel alone anymore. The house felt warm, lived in, full of possibility. She climbed the stairs to her room, changed into her nightgown, and crawled into bed. Rusty jumped up beside her, curling into a warm ball against her side. Through the window, she could see the stars still blazing overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. 3 months ago, she'd arrived here expecting nothing but exile and shame. Instead, she'd found purpose, respect, and the beginnings of something she hadn't dared hope for. Love. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own struggles, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. In the morning, she woke to find a note slipped under her door, written in Caleb's rough hand. The barn needs cleaning. Could use your help after breakfast, if you're willing. It was such a simple request, but it made her heart sing. He wasn't just asking her to clean a barn. He was asking her to work beside him, to be his partner in running this ranch. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Caleb already in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him smile. A real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She held up the note. "I'd be happy to help." "Good." He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Fair warning, it's a mess. Hasn't been properly cleaned in years." "I can handle it." And she could. She could handle anything now, because she wasn't facing it alone anymore. They worked side by side that day, and for the first time in months, Lydia felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. She felt hope. The barn took them 3 days to clean properly, and by the end of it, Lydia's hands were blistered and her back ached in places she didn't know could ache. But she'd never felt more satisfied. Working alongside Caleb, she'd learned things about him that silence at the dinner table had never revealed. He was meticulous, unable to leave a job half done. He was patient, showing her how to properly stack hay and repair worn leather without making her feel incompetent. And he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, little comments that made her laugh when she least expected it. "You missed a spot," he'd said on the second day, gesturing to a corner she'd already swept twice. "Where?" "Right there, and there, and actually pretty much everywhere." She'd thrown a handful of straw at him, and he ducked, that rare smile flickering across his face again. It was in these small moments that their marriage began to transform from arrangement to partnership. They fell into new rhythms, working together in the mornings, Caleb teaching her about ranch operations, while she taught him which plants could be used for medicine. Their dinners grew longer, filled with actual conversation instead of strained silence. And in the evenings, they sat together on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable quiet. But the real change came in late January, on a morning that started like any other and ended with everything different. Lydia was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. She looked up to see 3 riders coming up the road, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. The lead rider was a boy she recognized, Juan Delgado, maybe 14, who lived with his family on a small homestead about 5 miles south. "Senora Rowan," he called out, pulling his horse to a stop. "Please, you must come. There are children, many children. They are very sick. My sister, my cousins, the neighbors' children. Fever, rash, they cannot breathe right." Lydia's blood ran cold. Fever and rash together often meant scarlet fever or measles, both of which could kill children quickly if not treated. How many children? 8, maybe 9, all from the school. The school? Lydia frowned. She didn't know there was a school in the area. Senora Martinez, she teaches children from the nearby ranches. They meet in her barn twice a week, but now they are all sick, and Senora Martinez, she is sick too. Lydia didn't hesitate. Wait here. I need to get my supplies. She ran into the house and began throwing things into her medical bag. Herbs, bandages, her precious bottle of carbolic acid for disinfection, clean cloths, everything she might need. She was so focused that she didn't hear Caleb enter until he spoke. What's happening? She explained quickly while continuing to pack. When she finished, Caleb's face was grim. That's too many sick kids for you to handle alone. I'm coming with you. You have work. The work can wait. You can't treat 9 sick children by yourself. He was already moving toward the door. I'll saddle the horses. 5 minutes. They rode hard toward the Delgado homestead, Juan leading the way. The winter sun was bright but provided little warmth, and Lydia's breath came out in white puffs as they galloped across the rough terrain. Her mind was racing, trying to prepare for what she might find. 9 sick children. If it was measles, the mortality rate could be as high as 1 in 4, especially among the very young or poorly nourished. If it was scarlet fever, even worse. Please, she prayed silently, please let me know what to do. The Delgado homestead came into view, a small adobe house surrounded by several outbuildings. But it was the barn that drew Lydia's attention. Through the open doors, she could see people moving around, hear the sound of children crying. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and ran toward the barn. Inside, the scene was chaos. Children lay on blankets spread across the hay-covered floor, their faces flushed with fever, their skin covered in an angry red rash. Parents hovered over them, speaking in rapid Spanish, their voices tight with fear. And in the corner, Senora Martinez, a woman Lydia had never met, lay on her own blanket, clearly as ill as her students. Dios mío, Lydia whispered, taking in the scope of the disaster. An older woman approached her, tears streaming down her weathered face. Are you Senora Rowan, the healer? I'm not really a healer, please. You are our only hope. The doctor in town, he will not come. He says it is too contagious, too dangerous. But you came. You are here. Lydia felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people believed she could save their children. But what if she couldn't? What if her folk remedies and remembered wisdom weren't enough? She felt Caleb's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. Tell me what you need, he said quietly. His confidence in her steadied something inside her chest. She took a deep breath and let her training, such as it was, take over. First, we need to separate the children by symptoms. The ones with breathing difficulties in one area, the ones with mainly fever and rash in another. We need clean water boiling constantly. We need cool cloths for the fevers, and we need someone to keep track of each child. When they last drank water, when the fever spikes, any changes in symptoms. Caleb nodded and began issuing orders in Spanish, his voice carrying authority that the panicked parents responded to. Within minutes, the chaos had organized into something manageable. The children were sorted into 2 groups. A fire was blazing in a makeshift hearth, with pots of water heating over the flames. Parents were assigned to specific children to monitor them. Lydia moved from child to child, examining each one carefully. The rash was distinctive, bright red, covering the face and body with a sandpaper-like texture. The fever was high in all of them, some reaching dangerous levels. And 3 of the youngest were showing signs of respiratory distress, their breathing labored and wheezy. Scarlet fever. She was almost certain. It spread quickly among children in close quarters, which explained why the entire school had fallen ill. The treatment was limited. Keep the fever down. Keep them hydrated. Watch for complications like pneumonia or rheumatic fever. And pray. She started with the most critical cases, the 3 young ones struggling to breathe. She made a tent over each child using blankets and had water with eucalyptus leaves boiling beneath, creating steam to help open their airways. She brewed willow bark tea for the fevers and made sure each child took small sips of water mixed with honey and salt to prevent dehydration. Hours blurred together, Lydia moved from child to child, checking pulses, monitoring breathing, adjusting treatments. Caleb worked beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he held children while she dosed them with medicine or changed their sweat-soaked clothes. He never questioned her decisions, never hesitated, just did whatever she asked without complaint. As darkness fell, Lydia realized she'd been working for nearly 12 hours straight. Her hands were shaking with exhaustion, her back screaming in protest every time she bent over another child. But she couldn't stop. One of the boys, Carlos, only 6 years old, was getting worse. His fever had climbed dangerously high despite all her efforts, and he'd begun having seizures. "No, no, no," she muttered, packing his small body with cool cloths, trying desperately to bring the fever down. "Stay with us, Carlos. Stay with us." His mother knelt beside her, sobbing, saying prayers in Spanish. Caleb appeared with more cool water, and together they worked to lower the boy's temperature. But the seizures continued, and his breathing became more labored. Lydia had never felt more helpless. All her knowledge, all her herbs and remedies seemed worthless against this disease. She was watching a child die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Lydia," Caleb's voice was low, gentle. "You're doing everything possible. Sometimes everything possible isn't enough." "It has to be enough," she said fiercely. "He's 6 years old. He deserves to live." "I know, but you can't save everyone. No one can." She knew he was right, but accepting it felt like surrender. So she kept working, kept trying, kept fighting for this child's life with everything she had. Somewhere around midnight, Carlos's fever finally broke. The seizures stopped, his breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. His mother collapsed in relief, and Lydia sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to be okay," she whispered. "He's going to be okay." Caleb pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her while she cried tears of exhaustion and relief and fear. She buried her face in his chest and let herself fall apart for just a moment, secure in the knowledge that he would hold her together. "You saved him," he murmured into her hair. "You saved all of them. We don't know that yet. The crisis isn't over, but they have a chance now because of you." She pulled back to look at him, this man who'd become so much more than a husband in name only. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his clothes stained with sweat and sickness, but his eyes were warm with something that looked like pride. And maybe love, because of us, she corrected softly. He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his entire face. "Yeah, because of us." They worked through the night, taking turns sleeping for a few hours while the other monitored the children. By morning, all 9 children were showing improvement. The fevers were coming down, the rashes beginning to fade, the breathing easier. Senora Martinez was also recovering, weak but conscious and grateful. "You are a miracle worker," she said to Lydia, her voice hoarse. "These children would have died without you." "I'm not a miracle worker. I'm just someone who pays attention and remembers things her mother taught her." "Then your mother must have been a very wise woman." Lydia thought of her mother, who'd been so desperate to hide her daughter's shame that she'd sent her across the country. Was that wisdom, or just fear of what the neighbors would say? "She taught me useful things," Lydia said carefully. "That's something." It was 3 more days before all the children were well enough for their families to take them home. During that time, Lydia and Caleb barely left the barn, sleeping in shifts, eating whatever food the grateful families brought them, focused entirely on ensuring no child took a turn for the worse. On the 4th morning, as they finally prepared to ride back to their own ranch, every family wanted to thank them. They pressed gifts into Lydia's hands, hand-woven blankets, jars of preserves, fresh eggs, even a young goat that one family insisted she take. The children hugged her, calling her their angel, and their parents clasped her hands with tears in their eyes. "You gave us back our children," Juan's mother said. "How can we ever repay you?" "You don't need to repay me. Just take care of them. Love them. That's enough." The ride home was quiet, both of them too exhausted for conversation. When they finally reached the ranch, Lydia felt like she could barely stay in the saddle. Caleb helped her down, and she swayed on her feet, her legs weak from days of minimal sleep and constant work. "Inside," he said firmly. "You need food and sleep. So do you." I'll take care of the horses first. You go. She was too tired to argue. She stumbled into the house, kicked off her boots, and collapsed onto the sofa. She meant to get up and make something to eat, but her body had other ideas. Within seconds, she was asleep. She woke to the smell of bacon frying and opened her eyes to find the room dark except for lamplight flickering from the kitchen. She sat up, disoriented, and realized she'd slept for hours. The sky outside the window was black with night. "Caleb?" she called. He appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're awake. Good. Food's ready." "What time is it?" "Around 8. You slept all afternoon." "Did you sleep?" "A few hours. Come eat." She followed him into the kitchen to find he'd made a simple but substantial meal: bacon, eggs, biscuits, and coffee. They ate in silence, both too hungry and tired for conversation. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared experience and mutual respect. When they'd finished, Caleb cleared the plates and then turned to face her. "We need to talk." Lydia's heart skipped. Those 4 words never preceded anything good. "About what?" "About you." He crossed his arms, his expression serious. "Lydia, you can't keep doing this. You can't keep running yourself into the ground trying to save every sick person in the county." "I'm not." "Yes, you are. In the 4 months since you arrived, you've treated at least 40 people. You go days without proper sleep. You work until you collapse. And every time someone comes to the door with a sick child, you drop everything to help them. What else am I supposed to do? Let them die?" "No. But you can't be the only one carrying this burden. We need to find help. A real doctor, or at least someone else who can share the load." "There is no real doctor. The one in town is a drunk, and no one else knows how to—" "Then you need to teach them." He moved closer, his voice intense. "Lydia, you're one person. You're not invincible, no matter how much everyone treats you like you are. What happens when you get sick? What happens when you're so exhausted that you make a mistake and someone dies because of it?" His words hit her like a slap. She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been so focused on helping people, on proving her worth despite her inability to have children, that she hadn't considered the consequences of her own limitations. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I just know that when someone needs help, I have to try. And I love that about you." The words came out fierce, unplanned, and they hung in the air between them like something precious and fragile. "I love your compassion and your courage and your refusal to give up. But I need you to take care of yourself too, because I can't—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I can't lose you." Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You said you loved that about me." "What?" "Just now. You said you loved that about me." She took a step closer to him, her heart racing. "Do you love me, Caleb? Or just that one thing about me?" He stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then slowly, he reached out and cupped her cheek with his hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "I love everything about you," he said quietly. "The way you hum when you cook, the way you talk to that damn cat like he understands you, the way you put wildflowers in bottles all over the house, the way you face down people like Margaret Garrett without flinching, the way you cry over children you barely know, the way you've turned this empty house into a home." He paused, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I love you, Lydia. All of you. Not despite the fact that you can't have children, not because you're useful around the ranch. I love you because you're you." She couldn't speak. The words she'd never thought she'd hear, the acceptance she'd stopped believing was possible, was being offered to her by this quiet, wounded man who'd learned to speak through actions instead of words. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the first time you left me an unsigned note about fixing the water pump." He smiled at that, and then he was kissing her, gentle at first, tentative, as if he'd forgotten how. But Lydia kissed him back, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent. This was different from anything she'd experienced with Robert, her former fiancé. That had been pleasant but passionless, the appropriate affection of an appropriate match. This was fire and need and connection, the kind of kiss that made her understand why poets wrote about love like it was madness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I should have told you sooner. You've been telling me all along, she said. I just wasn't listening right. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, Caleb didn't go to his bedroom on the first floor. Instead, he climbed the stairs with Lydia, and when they reached her door, she took his hand and led him inside. They made love slowly, carefully, like two people who'd been hurt before and were afraid of breaking something precious. And afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Lydia felt a peace she'd never known. What if I never give you children? She whispered into the quiet. What if the doctor was right and I can't? Then we'll have a different kind of family, Caleb said, his hand stroking her hair. There are plenty of kids who need homes, orphans, abandoned children. We could give them a place to belong. You'd want that? To raise someone else's child? Lydia, I've spent the last 4 months watching you mother half the county. You think I don't know you'd be an incredible parent? Biology doesn't make family. Love does. She turned in his arms to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. He meant it. He really, truly meant it. Her inability to bear children didn't diminish her worth in his eyes. If anything, he saw it as an opportunity to love differently, to build family in a new way. How did I get so lucky? She asked, tracing the line of his jaw with her finger. I'm the lucky one. I was half dead when you arrived. You brought me back to life. They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time in 18 months, Lydia didn't dream of loss and failure. She dreamed of possibility. The next morning, Lydia woke to find Caleb already gone, but he'd left a note on the pillow. Riding into town, back by lunch. Stay home and rest for once. That's an order from your husband. Love, C. She smiled at the note, pressed it to her chest, and decided to obey. She spent the morning doing quiet things, baking bread, tending her herb garden, playing with Rusty the cat. It felt like a luxury, this peaceful morning with no emergencies to handle, no sick children to tend. But peace never lasted long. Around noon, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her first thought was that Caleb was home early, but when she looked out the window, she saw a wagon she didn't recognize pulling into the yard. The driver was an older man she'd never seen before, and he was alone. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. Can I help you? The man climbed down from the wagon slowly, his movements stiff with age. You Lydia Rowan? I am. Name's Frank Wilson. I run the children's home in Santa Fe. Heard about you from Father Dominic. He says you're good with kids. Lydia's heart began to beat faster. I suppose. What's this about? Got a situation. A boy, about 7 years old. Found him wandering on the road 3 days ago, half-starved, won't speak a word. We took him to the doctor, and physically he's fine, just malnourished. But he won't talk, won't tell us who he is or where he came from, won't hardly make eye contact. The old man scratched his beard. The children's home is full up. We got no room for another kid, especially one who needs special attention. And honestly, we ain't equipped to handle a child like this. What are you asking me? Father Dominic said you and your husband might be willing to take him in, temporarily, just until we can figure out who he is and where he belongs, or until we find someone permanent to take him. Lydia felt something clench in her chest. A lost child, alone and scared and silent. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to say yes, but this wasn't just her decision to make. My husband isn't here right now. I can't make this decision without him. Fair enough. Mr. Wilson walked to the back of the wagon. But maybe you could at least meet the boy. See if you think you could help him. Before she could answer, the old man was lowering the wagon's tailgate. Huddled in the back, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild winter sun, was the smallest, most frightened-looking child Lydia had ever seen. He had dark hair that hung in his eyes, skin tanned brown from sun exposure, and clothes that were little more than rags. But it was his eyes that broke her heart, large and brown, and completely empty of hope. He looked at her with the flat, dead expression of someone who expected nothing good from the world. In his small hands, he clutched a wooden toy horse, worn smooth from years of handling. Hello? Lydia said softly, approaching the wagon slowly. My name is Lydia. What's your name? The boy didn't respond, just stared at her with those haunted eyes. He don't talk, Mr. Wilson said. Ain't said a word since we found him. Where did you find him? Road between here and Santa Fe, middle of nowhere, no homesteads nearby, no wagon tracks, nothing. Like he just appeared out of thin air. Lydia crouched down so she was at eye level with the boy. Can you tell me your name? Or where you're from? Nothing, not even a flicker of recognition that she'd spoken. Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat? At the word eat, the boy's grip on the toy horse tightened and his eyes darted to the house and back to her. It wasn't much, but it was a response. Come on, Lydia said gently. Let's get you some food. You look like you could use a good meal. She held out her hand, and after a long moment, the boy took it. His hand was tiny and cold in hers, and she could feel every bone in his fingers. How long had he been starving? She led him into the house and settled him at the kitchen table. He sat perfectly still, the toy horse still clutched in one hand, watching her with wary eyes as she prepared food. She made him eggs and bread with butter and honey, and when she set the plate in front of him, he didn't move. It's okay, she said softly. You can eat. No one's going to take it away from you. Slowly, carefully, he picked up a piece of bread and took a small bite, then another. Then he was eating like a starving animal, shoving food into his mouth so fast she was afraid he'd choke. Slow down, she cautioned. There's plenty more. You don't have to rush. But he couldn't slow down. Whatever he'd been through had taught him that food was scarce and had to be eaten quickly before someone took it away. It made her furious and heartbroken in equal measure. Mr. Wilson stood in the doorway, watching. So, think you can help him? Lydia looked at the small boy sitting at her kitchen table, this lost child who needed someone to see him, to care for him, to teach him that the world could be kind. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't let him go back to an overcrowded children's home where he'd be just another mouth to feed. He can stay, she said, at least temporarily, until we figure out where he belongs. You sure? You ain't even talked to your husband. I'm sure. Caleb will understand. She hoped that was true. Mr. Wilson left an hour later, after making Lydia sign papers acknowledging temporary custody of the boy. She watched the wagon disappear down the road and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle over her shoulders. She'd taken in a child, a traumatized, silent child, without consulting her husband. What if Caleb was angry? What if this was too much, too fast? She turned back to the house to find the boy still sitting at the kitchen table, his empty plate in front of him, the toy horse clutched to his chest. He was watching her with those wary eyes, and she realized he was waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if she'd hurt him or help him. Would you like to see where you'll sleep? She asked gently. He didn't respond, but when she held out her hand, he took it. She led him upstairs to the third bedroom, the one she'd never entered because it felt like trespassing on Caleb's grief. But now she opened the door and found herself looking at a child's room, frozen in time. A small bed with a patchwork quilt. A wooden rocking horse in the corner. Shelves with a few toys and books. Everything covered in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise perfectly preserved, like a shrine to the boy who'd died here 5 years ago. Thomas's room. Caleb's son. The boy beside her made a small sound, the first sound she'd heard from him, and pulled away from her hand. He walked slowly to the rocking horse and stood in front of it, staring. Then, carefully, he reached out and touched its wooden mane. That belonged to another little boy, Lydia said softly. He lived here a long time ago, but I think he'd want you to play with it. The boy looked at her, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not quite hope, but maybe the shadow of curiosity. Then he climbed onto the rocking horse and began to rock, slowly at first, then faster, his small body moving with the rhythm. Lydia felt tears burning her eyes. This room had been empty for 5 years, a monument to loss, but now it held life again, and somehow that felt both right and terrifying. She heard hoofbeats outside and her heart jumped. Caleb was home. She left the boy rocking on the horse and hurried downstairs, trying to figure out how to explain what she'd done. Caleb was unsaddling his horse when she reached the barn. He looked up at her approach, and his face broke into that rare smile that still made her heart skip. Hey, thought I told you to rest today. I did rest, mostly. She twisted her hands together, nervous. Caleb, something happened while you were gone. The smile faded. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong exactly. It's just, there was a man here, Frank Wilson, from the children's home in Santa Fe. He brought a boy, maybe 7 years old. They found him wandering alone, half-starved, and he won't speak. The children's home is full, and they asked if we could take him in temporarily. Caleb went very still. And? And I said yes. The words came out in a rush. I know I should have waited to talk to you first, but he was so small and scared, and I couldn't send him back to an overcrowded orphanage where no one has time to really care for him. I'm sorry, I should have asked you first, but where is he now? Upstairs, in Thomas's room. She saw Caleb flinch at the name. I didn't know where else to put him, and I thought, show me. They walked back to the house in silence, and Lydia's anxiety grew with each step. She'd overstepped badly. That room was sacred to Caleb, a memorial to his lost son, and she'd put a stranger in it without permission. What had she been thinking? They climbed the stairs and Lydia pushed open the door to Thomas's room. The boy was still on the rocking horse, but he'd stopped rocking. He sat perfectly still, watching them with those wary, empty eyes. In the afternoon light streaming through the window, Lydia could see how thin he was, how his clothes hung on his small frame like they were made for someone twice his size. Caleb stood in the doorway, and Lydia watched emotions play across his face, grief, pain, and something else she couldn't identify. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Caleb walked slowly into the room and crouched down in front of the rocking horse, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. Hey there, he said quietly. My name's Caleb. What's yours? The boy just stared at him, no response. He hasn't spoken since they found him, Lydia explained. They don't know his name or where he came from. Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. That's okay. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Understand? Still nothing. But the boy's grip on his toy horse loosened slightly. That's a fine horse you got there, Caleb continued. I've got some real horses in the barn. Maybe tomorrow I can show them to you if you'd like. The boy blinked, and Lydia saw his eyes flick toward the window, toward the barn visible in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was interest. A tiny spark in all that emptiness. Caleb stood and turned to Lydia. He can stay, as long as he needs to. Relief flooded through her. Thank you. I know I should have asked first. You did the right thing. He looked back at the boy, his expression unreadable. This room's been empty too long. It's good to have a kid in it again. That night, they set up a proper bed for the boy in Thomas's old room. Lydia found clean clothes that had belonged to Thomas. They were a bit large, but they'd do until she could make alterations. She drew a bath and helped the boy wash, shocked by the bruises and scars that covered his thin body. Someone had hurt this child badly and repeatedly. The realization made her want to cry and rage in equal measure. The boy submitted to her ministrations without protest, but also without response. He was like a doll, moved this way and that, compliant but absent. It broke her heart. When he was clean and dressed in a nightshirt, she tucked him into bed. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? No response, just those empty eyes watching her in the lamplight. I'll leave the lamp burning low in case you wake up and feel scared. And I'm just down the hall if you need me, okay? Nothing. She hesitated in the doorway, wanting to say something comforting, something that would reach through whatever wall this child had built around himself. But words felt useless against whatever trauma he'd endured. Good night, she said softly, and closed the door partway. Downstairs, she found Caleb sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkness. She sat beside him, and for a while they didn't speak. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. Thomas would have been 9 now, if he'd lived. Lydia reached for his hand, and he let her take it. I'm sorry. If having another child in his room is too painful, it's not. Or maybe it is, but it's the right kind of pain, like when you stretch a muscle that's been frozen too long. Hurts, but in a way that means healing. What was he like, Thomas? Caleb was quiet for so long that Lydia thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He was loud. That's what I remember most. Always talking, always asking questions, always making noise. Couldn't sit still for more than 2 minutes. Sarah used to say he was like trying to contain a tornado. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He loved horses. Used to beg me to let him ride the big ones, even though he was barely tall enough to reach the stirrup. And he was fearless. Nothing scared him. Not storms, not snakes, not the dark. He'd run headlong into anything. He sounds wonderful. He was. And that boy upstairs. Caleb stopped, his jaw working. He's the opposite. He's so scared he can't even speak, so hurt that he's shut down completely. But he's still a kid who needs someone, and I think we can be that for him. Even though we don't know anything about him, we don't even know his name. Then we'll give him one, until he's ready to tell us his real one. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house above them, a lost child was sleeping in a room that had been waiting 5 years to hold life again. And despite all the uncertainty, all the potential complications, Lydia felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was meant to be. The next few weeks were difficult in ways Lydia hadn't anticipated. The boy, they'd started calling him Eli, a name that meant ascended or uplifted, hoping it would prove prophetic, existed in their house like a ghost. He ate when food was placed in front of him, wore the clothes she laid out, followed basic instructions. But he never spoke, never smiled, never showed any emotion beyond fear when someone moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Lydia threw herself into caring for him with the same intensity she brought to caring for sick children. She cooked his favorite foods, or tried to since he never indicated preferences, read to him in the evenings, showed him the ranch and the animals. Nothing seemed to reach him. Caleb took a different approach. He simply included Eli in his daily routines, treating him not as a damaged child who needed fixing, but as a small ranch hand who needed training. Every morning, he'd knock on Eli's door and say, "Time for chores." And Eli would follow him out to the barn to help feed the horses, muck stalls, and check fences. The boy never spoke, but he worked, and Lydia noticed that he seemed most at peace when he was with Caleb, doing simple physical tasks that required no words. It was during one of these morning routines that the first real breakthrough happened. Lydia was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard a commotion from the barn. Not frightened sounds, but excited ones. She ran to the window and saw Caleb and Eli in the corral, standing next to one of the horses. Eli was reaching up to touch the horse's nose, his face showing the first expression she'd seen from him: wonder. She watched as Caleb lifted Eli up and settled him on the horse's back, keeping one hand on the boy to steady him. And then, for just a moment, Eli smiled. It was brief, barely there, but it was real. Lydia felt tears streaming down her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Progress. Finally, progress. That night at dinner, Eli did something new. Instead of staring at his plate while he ate, he looked up at Caleb and pointed to the barn. "You want to go back to the barn?" Caleb asked. Eli nodded. It was the first time he'd actively communicated a desire, and both Caleb and Lydia tried to keep their reactions measured, not wanting to scare him back into silence. "After dinner, we'll go see the horses," Caleb said calmly. "Sound good?" Another nod. It wasn't much, but it was everything. As winter gave way to early spring, Eli slowly began to emerge from his shell. He still didn't speak, but he started responding with nods and head shakes. He began following Lydia around during the day, helping her in the garden and watching as she treated sick neighbors. And he grew attached to Caleb in a way that was both heartbreaking and beautiful to watch, following him everywhere, standing close when Caleb worked, seeking his presence like a plant seeking sun. "He's becoming your shadow," Lydia said one evening, watching Eli sitting on the porch step where Caleb was fixing a saddle. "He needs a father, or the closest thing to one he can get. What if his real father is out there somewhere, looking for him?" Caleb's face darkened. A real father doesn't let his child end up half-starved and wandering alone in the desert. A real father protects his kid. If that boy has family out there, they don't deserve him back. The fierceness in his voice surprised her, but she understood it. They'd both fallen in love with this broken child, and the thought of losing him hurt almost as much as the thought of never having children of their own. In April, the annual spring fair came to redemption. The entire county turned out for 3 days of festivities: horse races, shooting competitions, pie contests, and dancing. Lydia had been looking forward to it, but as the date approached, she grew anxious. The last time they'd been to a town gathering, Margaret Garrett had publicly humiliated her. What would people say now that she and Caleb had taken in an orphan? Would they see it as charity, or would someone make cruel comments about the barren woman trying to replace what she couldn't create? "Stop worrying," Caleb said the morning of the fair, watching her pace the kitchen. "People love you. You've saved half their children. They're not going to say anything cruel." "Margaret Garrett might." "Margaret Garrett can go to hell." "Caleb!" But she was smiling despite herself. They hitched up the wagon and helped Eli climb into the back. He was wearing new clothes Lydia had made, proper pants and a shirt that actually fit, and his hair was neatly trimmed. He looked like a different child from the broken, silent boy who'd arrived 3 months ago. The fair was in full swing when they arrived, with people everywhere and music floating on the warm spring air. Lydia had brought 3 pies for the contest: apple, cherry, and pumpkin, and she carried them carefully through the crowd toward the judging tables. "Mrs. Rowan!" Sarah Mitchell appeared at her elbow, smiling warmly. "You came! And who is this handsome young man?" Eli pressed closer to Caleb's leg, and Caleb put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is Eli. He's staying with us." "How wonderful! Children are such a blessing." Sarah's smile was genuine, without any hint of the pity or judgment Lydia had feared. "Will he be at the children's games this afternoon? My boys would love to meet him." Before Lydia could explain that Eli didn't speak, Caleb answered, "We'll see how he feels. He's still getting used to crowds." As Sarah walked away, Lydia squeezed Caleb's hand gratefully. He'd protected Eli from uncomfortable questions without making it obvious, and she loved him even more for it. They spent the morning wandering the fair, and Lydia was overwhelmed by how many people stopped to greet them. Every family seemed to have a story: a child she'd saved, an illness she'd helped treat, a crisis she'd managed. They thanked her, blessed her, treated her like she was something special, and not one person made a cruel comment about her inability to have children. It was early afternoon when trouble found them. Lydia was at the pie judging table, waiting for the results, when she heard raised voices nearby. She turned to see Margaret Garrett standing in front of Caleb and Eli, her face twisted with disgust. "That's him, isn't it? The orphan you took in?" Margaret's voice was loud enough to attract attention, and people were starting to gather. "How desperate must you be, Caleb, to take in someone else's unwanted brat? Or is this your barren wife's idea, playing house with a child that isn't yours?" Lydia felt rage explode in her chest. She'd tolerated Margaret's cruelty directed at her, but attacking Eli was unforgivable. She pushed through the crowd and placed herself between Margaret and the boy. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He's a child. A scared, traumatized child who's been through hell, and you have the audacity to call him unwanted? I'm just stating facts. He's not yours. He'll never be yours. You can't have children, so you're playing pretend with someone else's." "You're right that I can't have children," Lydia cut her off. "You're right that Eli isn't mine by blood. But you're wrong about everything else. Because family isn't about blood. It's about love and choice and showing up day after day to care for someone." She took a step closer to Margaret, her voice rising. "I've spent the last 6 months caring for the children of this county. I've sat up nights with sick babies. I've held dying children and prayed them back to life. I've taught ranch kids their letters and tended their wounds and loved them like they were my own. And Eli?" She glanced back at the boy who was watching her with wide eyes. "Eli is my son now. Not because I gave birth to him, but because I choose to love him. Because Caleb and I both choose to give him a home and a family and everything he's been missing." The crowd had grown silent, watching the confrontation with rapt attention. Margaret's face was red with fury, but before she could respond, a voice rang out from the judging table. "The blue ribbon for Best Pie goes to Lydia Rowan for her apple pie." The announcement broke the tension, and people began to clap. Sarah Mitchell started it, but soon the entire crowd was applauding, not just for the pie, but for Lydia's words, for her defense of Eli, for everything she represented. Margaret Garrett stood alone in her fury as people turned their backs on her and surrounded Lydia instead. Someone pressed the blue ribbon into her hand. Children crowded close to see it, and through it all, Lydia felt Eli's small hand slip into hers, holding tight. She looked down at him and saw tears streaming down his face. But these weren't tears of sadness. His eyes were shining with something she hadn't seen before. Gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of trust. And his mouth was moving, trying to form words that wouldn't quite come. "It's okay," she whispered, kneeling down to his level. "You don't have to say anything. I know." But he kept trying, his face scrunched with concentration. And finally, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he spoke his first words. You called me your son." The world stopped. Every person in the crowd heard it and went completely still. Lydia felt tears streaming down her face as she pulled Eli into a fierce hug. "You are my son," she said into his hair. "If you'll have me as your mother." She felt him nod against her shoulder, and then Caleb was there too, wrapping both of them in his arms, and they were a family. Broken pieces that had somehow fit together to make something whole. The crowd erupted in cheers, and someone started playing music, and the fair continued around them, but Lydia barely noticed. She was too focused on the small boy in her arms who'd finally started to heal. That evening, after they'd returned home and put Eli to bed, Lydia and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sunset. The spring air was warm and fragrant with the smell of blooming desert flowers, and everything felt perfect in a way that scared her. When life felt this good, something usually came along to destroy it. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. "That I'm happy, and that makes me nervous." "Why?" "Because every time I've been happy, something terrible happens. When I was pregnant with my first baby, I was so happy. Then I fell, and everything fell apart. When I got engaged to Robert, I thought my life was perfect. Then he left. I'm afraid that if I let myself be too happy now, something will stop." Caleb turned to face her, his hands framing her face. "You can't live your life afraid of happiness. Bad things happen whether we're happy or not. At least if we're happy, we have something to remember when times get hard. But what if someone comes looking for Eli? What if his real family? We'll deal with that if it happens. But right now, in this moment, he's ours and we're his, and we're happy. That's enough." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that happiness could last, that love could endure, that she deserved this second chance at family. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much it scares me." "Good. Be scared, be happy, feel everything. That's what living is." He kissed her softly. "And I love you too. More than I thought I could love anyone again." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and Lydia let herself feel it. The happiness, the fear, the love, all of it tangled together. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe the point wasn't to avoid pain, but to embrace joy when it came, to hold it close and be grateful for however long it lasted. Inside the house, she heard a small sound and turned to see Eli standing in the doorway, his toy horse clutched in one hand. He looked small and vulnerable in his nightshirt, his eyes uncertain. "Can't sleep?" she asked gently. He shook his head and walked toward them. Without a word, he climbed onto Lydia's lap, curling into her like he'd done it 1,000 times before. She wrapped her arms around him, and Caleb pulled them both closer, and they sat like that as night fell completely. A family born not from blood, but from choice, from healing, from love that refused to quit. "Tell me a story," Eli whispered, his voice still hesitant but growing stronger. "What kind of story?" Lydia asked. "A happy one, with a family that stays together." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes but kept her voice steady. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought she was broken. She'd lost everything. Her baby, her fiancé, her home, her hope. Everyone told her she was worthless because she couldn't have children. So they sent her far away to marry a stranger and disappear from their lives." "That's not a happy beginning," Eli said. "No, it's not. But wait, because the stranger she married turned out to be kind and lonely and just as broken as she was. And together, they started to heal each other. They built a home and a life and learned how to be happy again. And then one day, a special little boy came into their lives. A boy who needed a family as much as they needed him. And they all lived happily ever after," Eli finished. "No," Lydia said softly. "They lived. They had hard days and good days. They faced troubles and overcame them together. They cried sometimes and laughed a lot. They weren't perfect, but they were family, and that was better than any fairy tale. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Can I call you Mama?" Lydia's heart broke and healed simultaneously. "Yes. Yes, you can call me Mama." "And you Papa?" he asked Caleb. "I'd be honored," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. Eli settled more deeply into Lydia's arms with a contented sigh. Within minutes, he was asleep, his breathing deep and even, the toy horse still clutched in his hand. "We should put him to bed," Caleb whispered. "In a minute. I just want to hold him a little longer." So they stayed on the porch, the three of them wrapped in blankets and love, while the desert night settled around them. And Lydia thought about how far she'd come from that desperate woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach 6 months ago, convinced her life was over. She'd been wrong. Her life hadn't ended. It had just been waiting to begin. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch transformed under Lydia's care. The garden she'd planted months ago exploded with life. Tomatoes hanging heavy on the vine, squash sprawling across the ground, beans climbing their poles toward the sun. Eli spent hours there with her, learning the names of plants and how to coax life from the hard desert soil. He talked more now, though he was still quiet by nature, his words measured and careful, like someone who'd learned that speaking could be dangerous. But he laughed. That was the miracle that never ceased to amaze Lydia, the sound of a child's laughter ringing through the house that had been silent for so long. Caleb would chase him through the barn, or Rusty the cat would do something ridiculous, and Eli would laugh with pure, unguarded joy. Those moments made everything worthwhile. It was late June when their fragile happiness faced its first real test. Lydia was teaching Eli his letters on the porch. He was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge after years of neglect. When a wagon appeared on the road, she shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and felt her stomach clench. She recognized the driver, Sheriff Tom Bradley from Santa Fe, a decent man she'd met once when delivering medicine to the jail for a sick prisoner. "Eli, go inside and find your papa," she said quietly. "Tell him we have visitors." The boy looked at the approaching wagon, and something in his face shuddered closed, all the progress of the past months disappearing in an instant. He backed toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. "It's all right," Lydia said, though her heart was racing. "Go on." Eli disappeared inside just as the wagon pulled into the yard. Sheriff Bradley climbed down, and Lydia saw he wasn't alone. A woman sat in the passenger seat, thin and worn, with graying hair and a face etched with hardship and something harder. Her eyes scanned the ranch with calculating coldness. "Mrs. Rowan," Sheriff Bradley said, removing his hat. "Sorry to come unannounced. This here is Mrs. Florence Garrett. She's—" "Garrett?" Lydia interrupted, her voice sharp. "Related to Margaret Garrett?" "My sister-in-law," the woman said, her voice nasal and unpleasant. "Though I don't see what that has to do with anything. I'm here about the boy." Lydia felt ice flood her veins. "What boy?" "Don't play stupid. The Mexican brat you took in. His name is Elias, and he belongs to me." Caleb appeared in the doorway. Eli pressed against his leg. The boy had gone completely white, and he was shaking so hard Lydia could see it from across the yard. "That's him," Florence said, pointing. "That's my dead sister's boy. He ran away 4 months ago, and I've been searching for him ever since." "He didn't run away," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He was found half-starved on the road, covered in bruises. He was so scared he couldn't speak. Children exaggerate. He was disciplined for his own good. Spare the rod, spoil the child. That's what the good book says. Now, I've come to take him home where he belongs." "No." Lydia moved to stand between Florence and the porch. "He's not going anywhere with you." Florence's eyes narrowed. "You got no legal right to keep him. He's my nephew, my blood. The law says he's mine." "The law also says children shouldn't be beaten and starved," Caleb said. "Sheriff, you saw the state he was in when he was found. You going to send him back to that?" Sheriff Bradley looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Rowan, I understand your concern, but Mrs. Garrett does have a legal claim. Unless there's proof of abuse that would hold up in court." "Look at him," Lydia gestured to Eli, who was now crying silently, his whole body trembling. "Look at his face and tell me he's not terrified of her." Children are afraid of discipline, Florence said coldly. That don't mean abuse. It means proper raising. Now, Elias, get in this wagon. We're going home. His name is Eli, Lydia said fiercely. And he is home. Florence laughed, a brittle sound. Home? With a barren woman playing house and a man stupid enough to marry her? Margaret told me all about you, Mrs. Rowan, how you can't have children of your own, so you steal other people's. Well, this one ain't yours to keep. I have custody papers, Lydia said desperately. From the children's home, legal documents saying he can stay with us. Temporary custody, Sheriff Bradley said gently. Until family could be found. Now family's been found, and the law's clear. Blood relatives have first claim. Lydia felt panic rising in her chest. This couldn't be happening. They couldn't lose Eli, not after everything. Not after he'd finally learned to smile and laugh and trust again. Please, she said, her voice breaking. Sheriff, if you take him back to her, he'll die. Maybe not right away, but his spirit will die. Everything we've helped him rebuild will be destroyed. Please don't do this. I got my orders, ma'am. Unless you got evidence of abuse that'll hold up in court, my hands are tied. Evidence? Caleb's voice was sharp. I got a barn full of ranch hands who saw the condition he was in when he arrived. I got the doctor's report from the children's home documenting malnutrition and multiple healed fractures. I got... Healed fractures ain't proof of abuse, Florence interrupted. Boys fall out of trees, they get kicked by horses. That's just life. Not when there's 20 of them, Caleb shot back. Not when they're all in different stages of healing. Not when the child is so traumatized he can't speak. Sheriff Bradley sighed heavily. Look, I don't like this any more than you do, but the law's the law. Now, Mrs. Garrett has agreed to let me inspect her home before returning the boy. If I find evidence of dangerous conditions, I can petition for the courts to review custody. But that takes time, and until then, no! Eli's voice rang out, high and desperate. He pushed away from Caleb and ran to Lydia, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her dress. No, Mama, please! Don't let her take me, please! The word Mama hung in the air, and Lydia felt something break inside her chest. She wrapped her arms around Eli and held him tight, knowing she might be holding him for the last time. You can't have him, she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. I don't care what the law says. You're not taking him. Mrs. Rowan, Sheriff Bradley said quietly, don't make this harder than it has to be. Don't make me arrest you for obstruction. Then arrest me, Lydia straightened, still holding Eli. Arrest us both, because we're not giving him up without a fight. Florence made an impatient sound. This is ridiculous. Sheriff, do your job. Take the boy. Sheriff Bradley looked at Caleb, then at Lydia and Eli clinging to each other, and something in his face shifted. Mrs. Garrett, I'm going to need to see documentation proving your relationship to the boy. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, something official. I told you he's my dead sister's son. Then you should have paperwork. Bring it to my office in Santa Fe tomorrow, and we'll proceed from there. But I'm not taking a child from a good home without proper documentation. Florence's face went red with fury. The law says I use my judgment in cases involving children, Sheriff Bradley interrupted, and my judgment says I need to see proof of your claim before I tear this boy away from the only family he feels safe with. You come to my office tomorrow with documentation, and we'll sort this out proper. This is outrageous. Margaret said you people out here were lawless, but I didn't believe it. Tomorrow, Mrs. Garrett, my office. 9 o'clock. The sheriff's voice was firm, brooking no argument. Florence climbed back into the wagon, her face twisted with rage. This isn't over. That boy is mine by blood and by law. I'll be back with every piece of paper you need, and then we'll see who's right. The wagon pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in its wake. Lydia sank to her knees, still holding Eli, and let herself cry. Caleb knelt beside them, wrapping them both in his arms. We're not giving up, he said fiercely. I don't care what it takes. We're not losing him. But the law can be fought. We'll get lawyers. We'll go to court. We'll do whatever we have to do. With what money? Lydia asked desperately. Lawyers cost a fortune. We're ranchers, Caleb. We don't have that kind of money. Then we'll find it. We'll sell cattle, take out loans, sell the damn ranch if we have to, but we're not giving up. That night, Eli refused to sleep in his own room. He clung to Lydia and cried every time she tried to put him to bed, terrified that she'd disappear while he slept. Finally, they brought him into their bedroom, and he slept between them, small and vulnerable, holding Lydia's hand on one side and Caleb's on the other. "I won't go back," he whispered in the darkness. "I'll run away again. I'll hide where she can't find me." "You're not going anywhere," Lydia said, though her heart was breaking with the lie. Because what if they couldn't stop Florence? What if the law really did give her custody? "Aunt Florence is mean," Eli said quietly. "After Mama died, she said I was a burden. She said she only kept me because it was her Christian duty, but I had to earn my keep. If I didn't work hard enough, or if I cried, or if I asked for food, she'd lock me in the cellar, sometimes for days." Lydia felt rage and grief warring in her chest. "How long were you with her?" 2 years, since I was 5. Mama got sick after Papa died, and she couldn't take care of me anymore. Aunt Florence said she'd help, but after Mama died, everything changed." "How did you end up on the road?" Caleb asked gently. "I ran away. She beat me for breaking a plate. It was an accident. I just dropped it. And she locked me in the cellar again. But this time I found a loose board and squeezed through. I ran and ran until I couldn't run anymore. And then Mr. Wilson found me." "You're safe now," Lydia whispered, though she didn't know if it was true. "We won't let her hurt you again." But Eli had lived through too much to believe in promises. Adults always say that. But then they give you away, or they die, or they hurt you. Nobody keeps you safe. "We will," Caleb said firmly. "I swear to you, son, we will." The next morning, Caleb rode to Santa Fe to meet with Sheriff Bradley and see what could be done. He returned late that evening, his face grim. "She brought documentation," he said, pouring himself a whiskey with shaking hands. "Birth certificate for Eli's mother showing Florence as her sister. Marriage certificate proving she's a Garrett by marriage. Letters from a priest vouching for her character. Everything legal and proper." "What did the sheriff say?" "He said his hands are tied. Florence has a legal claim as blood family. Unless we can prove in court that she's unfit, and prove it fast, she gets custody." "How fast?" "She's coming back in 3 days with a court order. We have 3 days to stop her, or we lose him." 3 days. It felt like a death sentence. Lydia spent that night lying awake, listening to Eli's breathing beside her, trying to think of something, anything they could do. They had no money for lawyers, no political connections, no leverage except the truth of what Florence had done, and truth without proof meant nothing to the law. She must have dozed off eventually because she woke to Caleb shaking her shoulder gently. Dawn was breaking outside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "We're going into town. All of us." "Why?" "Because if the law won't help us, maybe the people will." They rode into Redemption as the town was waking up. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in the main square and climbed down, then helped Lydia and Eli down. People were starting to emerge from buildings, shopkeepers opening for business, ranchers coming in for supplies, families heading to church for early morning services. Caleb cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Town meeting! Right here! Right now! Everyone who cares about justice and children, I need you." People looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but they came. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the general store. Diego Mendoza appeared with his family. Father Dominic hurried over from the church. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. "What's this about, Caleb?" someone called. Caleb lifted Eli up so everyone could see him. "This is my son, Eli. 3 days from now, the law is going to give him back to the woman who beat him, starved him, and locked him in a cellar for days at a time. They're going to take him from the only home where he's ever felt safe and loved. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. Legally, I'm powerless." The crowd murmured, angry and shocked. "But here's what I know," Caleb continued, his voice ringing out over the square. "I know that laws are made by people, and people can change laws. I know that this town, this community, has power. Power to stand up and say this is wrong. Power to protect children who need protecting." "What do you want us to do?" Father Dominic asked. "I want you to go to Santa Fe. I want you to flood the sheriff's office and the courthouse with testimonies about Eli. about the condition he was in when he was found, about how he's healed and grown in our care, about what sending him back will do to him. I want you to make so much noise that they can't ignore you." "I'll go," Sarah Mitchell said immediately. "I'll testify." "Me too," Diego Mendoza added. "This boy saved my wife's life by bringing Senora Rowan to help her. I will not let him be sent back to an abuser." "And I'll write a letter to the bishop," Father Dominic said. "The church has influence. We can apply pressure." One by one, people stepped forward to offer help. Some would testify, others would write letters. A few ranchers offered to pool money for a lawyer. The town doctor, sober for once, said he'd document every healed injury on Eli's body and submit a medical report. But it was Sarah Mitchell who offered the most unexpected help. "My brother is a judge in Albuquerque. I'll send him a telegram today. He knows people in Santa Fe, people who can push this case to the right courts." Lydia felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the community rally around them. These were people she'd helped, yes, but more than that, they were people who saw injustice and refused to accept it. They were people who believed that family was more than blood and that love mattered more than law. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. People flooded the sheriff's office in Santa Fe with testimonies. Father Dominic's bishop wrote a scathing letter about Christian duty and the difference between legal guardianship and true care. The doctor's report documented 23 healed fractures, multiple scars from being struck with objects, and signs of prolonged malnutrition. And Sarah Mitchell's brother, Judge Harrison, used his connections to fast-track a hearing on Eli's custody. Florence Garrett arrived on the third day with her court order, only to find Sheriff Bradley waiting with a different set of papers. "There's been a development, Mrs. Garrett. A formal custody challenge has been filed by Mr. and Mrs. Rowan. You're both required to appear before Judge Martinez tomorrow morning for a full hearing." "This is outrageous," Florence sputtered. "I have a legal claim." "And now they do too. Judge will sort it out." The hearing was held in a small courthouse in Santa Fe, packed with people from Redemption who'd come to support the Rowans. Lydia sat in the front row, her hand gripping Caleb's so tight her knuckles were white. Eli sat between them, pressed against Lydia's side, his toy horse clutched to his chest. Florence Garrett's lawyer presented her case first: blood relation, legal documentation, Christian duty to care for family. He painted Florence as a devoted aunt who'd searched tirelessly for her missing nephew and who deserved to have him returned. Then it was their turn. The lawyer that the community had pooled money to hire stood and called witness after witness. The doctor testified about Eli's injuries. Sarah Mitchell described the terrified, silent child who'd been found on the road. Diego Mendoza spoke about how Eli had blossomed under the Rowans' care. Father Dominic talked about the difference between obligation and love. And then the lawyer called Eli himself to the stand. "No," Lydia whispered, gripping Caleb's arm. "He can't. He's too young, too traumatized." But Eli stood up, his small frame shaking but his face determined. He walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, his voice barely audible as he promised to tell the truth. The lawyer was gentle with him, asking simple questions. "Eli, do you remember living with your Aunt Florence?" "Yes." "Can you tell the judge what that was like?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice that grew stronger as he spoke, he began to describe 2 years of hell. The beatings, the cellar, the days without food, the constant fear. He spoke calmly, factually, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. But his hands were shaking, and tears rolled down his face as he talked. "And now you live with Mr. and Mrs. Rowan?" the lawyer asked gently. "Yes, with Mama and Papa." "What's that like?" For the first time, Eli smiled. "It's like the bad dreams are over. Mama teaches me to read and lets me help in the garden. Papa shows me how to care for horses and tells me I'm doing a good job. They tuck me in at night and make sure I'm not scared. They feed me when I'm hungry and hold me when I cry. They love me." "If the judge says you have to go back to your Aunt Florence, how would you feel?" Eli looked directly at the judge, his eyes pleading. "I would rather die. Please don't make me go back, please." The courtroom was completely silent. Even Florence's lawyer looked uncomfortable. The judge leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "Young man, I want you to know that no one here wants to hurt you. We all want what's best for you. Can you understand that?" Eli nodded, wiping his eyes. "All right, you can step down." The lawyers presented their closing arguments. Florence's lawyer talked about the sanctity of blood relations and the importance of family. The Rowan's lawyer talked about the spirit of the law versus the letter of it, about what truly served a child's best interests. And then they waited while the judge reviewed documents and made notes. The silence felt eternal. Lydia held Caleb's hand and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. "Please, please, please." Finally, Judge Martinez looked up. "I've reviewed the evidence presented today, and I must say this is one of the most clear-cut cases I've ever seen. Mrs. Garrett, the medical evidence alone is damning. 23 healed fractures on a child who's only 7 years old? That's not accidents. That's systematic abuse. Add in the testimony about the cellar, the starvation, the terror this child lived in, and I have no choice but to find you an unfit guardian." Florence leaped to her feet. "You can't." "Sit down, Mrs. Garrett, or I'll have you removed." Now, as for custody, the law does typically favor blood relations. However, the law also requires that the child's welfare be the primary concern. And it's clear to me that this child's welfare depends on remaining with Mr. and Mrs. Rowan. Lydia couldn't breathe. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? "Therefore, I am terminating Mrs. Garrett's guardianship and granting full legal custody to Caleb and Lydia Rowan, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order preventing Mrs. Garrett from having any contact with the child. This decision is final." The courtroom erupted. People were cheering, crying, hugging each other. Lydia pulled Eli into her arms and held him while he sobbed with relief. Caleb wrapped them both in his embrace, his own face wet with tears. "It's over," he whispered. "You're ours now. Really, truly ours. No one can take you away." "Forever?" Eli asked, his voice muffled against Lydia's shoulder. "Forever," Lydia promised. "You're our son. Nothing will ever change that." They drove home that evening as a family, legally and irrevocably. The sun was setting as they pulled into the ranch, painting everything in gold and orange light. Lydia looked at the house, their home, and felt a peace settle over her that she'd never thought possible. She'd come here broken, believing she was worthless because she couldn't have children, but she'd learned that worth wasn't measured in biology. It was measured in love, in showing up, in choosing to care for others even when it was hard. She'd learned that family wasn't about blood, but about commitment and choice, and the daily decision to love someone no matter what. That night, after Eli was asleep in his room, their son, legally now forever, Lydia and Caleb sat on the porch as they had so many times before. But everything was different now. "You know what I realized today?" Lydia said quietly. "When everyone came to testify for us, when the whole town rallied around us, I realized that we built something here. Not just a family, but a community. People who care for each other, people who show up when it matters." "You built that," Caleb corrected. "You're the one who started caring for people, who showed them that love doesn't have conditions or limits." "We built it together," she insisted. "You and me and Eli. We're proof that broken things can be mended, that people who've lost everything can find it again, that love is stronger than law or blood or anything else." Caleb pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and closer by, they could hear Eli's gentle snoring through the open window. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "Coming here? Marrying a stranger? Giving up your old life?" Lydia thought about the girl she'd been 18 months ago, broken and ashamed, convinced her life was over. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone she'd once known but no longer recognized. "No," she said firmly, "not for a second. My old life was built on a lie. The lie that my worth depended on my ability to have children. This life is built on truth. The truth that love is what matters, that family is what you make it, that being barren doesn't mean being empty." "You're the least empty person I've ever met," Caleb said softly. "You're full of life and love and courage. You give it to everyone around you. You gave it to me when I was dead inside. You gave it to Eli when he'd given up hope. You're not barren, Lydia. You're abundant. She turned to kiss him, and the kiss was sweet with promise and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Caleb stood and held out his hand. Come on, let's go inside. Our son might wake up and wonder where we are. Our son. The words would never stop making her heart sing. They walked inside together, checking on Eli one more time before heading to their own room. The boy was sprawled across his bed, one arm thrown over his head, his toy horse lying beside him. He looked peaceful and safe and loved, everything a child should be. In the years that followed, the ranch would continue to grow. Lydia would establish a proper school for the ranch children, teaching them not just letters and numbers, but compassion and courage. Eli would grow into a strong, kind young man who never forgot what it meant to be lost and found again. They would take in other children over the years, orphans and castaways who needed homes, and build a family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. The town would remember forever the day Lydia Cross Rowan stood up to Margaret Garrett and declared that her worth wasn't measured by her womb. They would tell stories about the barren bride who saved half the county's children and built a family from love instead of biology. And travelers passing through would see the ranch, always full of children and laughter and life, and ask about it. That's the Rowan place, but locals would say. That's where the barren woman lives. But those who looked closer, who saw the children running through the fields and the love that permeated every corner of the property, would correct them. She's not barren, they'd say. She's the most fertile woman in the county. She just grows love instead of babies. And in the end, that was the truest thing anyone ever said about Lydia Rowan. She had been sent to New Mexico to disappear, to be forgotten, to live out her days in shame and silence. Instead, she had bloomed in the desert like a wildflower after rain, unexpected, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. She had taken everything that was meant to break her and used it to build something magnificent. She had proven that barrenness was a lie, that worth wasn't measured in fertility, but in the capacity to love. That family was a choice, not an accident of biology, and that sometimes the greatest lives were built not from perfection, but from broken pieces carefully mended into something new. On her 40th birthday, surrounded by Caleb and Eli and the 4 other children they'd taken in over the years, Lydia stood in the garden she'd planted 15 years earlier and looked at everything she'd grown, not just vegetables and herbs, but hope and healing and home. Happy? Caleb asked, sliding his arm around her waist. She leaned into him, watching their children play in the fading light, and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Happier than I ever imagined possible, she said. Happier than I deserve. You deserve everything, Caleb said firmly. Everything good in this world and more. And as the sun set over the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in impossible colors, Lydia believed him. She had been broken and lost and convinced she was worthless. But she had learned the greatest truth of all, that love was the only thing that mattered, and love was something she had in abundance. She was not barren. She had never been barren. She was full of life, and that life had saved not just her, but everyone lucky enough to know her. And that was a story worth telling.